Over the course of this lecture series, I'll be taking you on a journey. It's going to be an unusual journey in certain respects, and I want to outline its contours and some of the uncommon features before we begin. We're going to be looking at whether there may be a deeper meaning to human life than we ordinarily experience, and whether philosophy can help us to determine what that meaning might be. Now, some are going to say, and they might say, that such matters come down to whether we're healthy, whether we enjoy life, and whether we're successful. And others might feel that such matters really are private and belong to the realm of religion. During our journey together, we will respect those views, but we're going to follow a different path, a philosophical path. There are three fundamental questions we must ask within the context of philosophy. Is reliable knowledge of our human nature possible? In fact, do human beings even have a nature? In a time such as ours, perhaps far less superstitious than disenchanted, what might be the human predicament? Is there one? And can human life be lived with both integrity and fulfillment? And might philosophy help us to find that integrity and fulfillment? Some of the issues we will discuss together are pretty complicated and controversial, but I'll hope to present a number of perspectives with which to engage you. No one could agree with all of them, so if you agree with some of these views as we go along, then I hope you'll genuinely value them and hopefully be enriched by them. If you disagree with some of the views that we'll be looking at, I do hope you'll still dwell with them, if only to stimulate your thinking even further. Let's look for a moment at the backdrop from which the sorts of ideas that are going to be concerning us arose. We start with an ancient model. I'm going to be calling it the Axial model. It was developed somewhere between 800 and 200 before the Common Era, in roughly a 600-year period. In the Axial model, a sharp distinction was made between this world and some kind of a beyond. And the idea arose that although we are in this world, we are not altogether of this world. And on this model, the Axial model, human life is considered a journey that leads from appearance to reality, from bondage to liberation, from confusion to insight, and darkness to light. In the 18th century, we come to the Enlightenment period and an Enlightenment challenge to this axial notion, when it was thought important to abandon the past and all old beliefs and superstitions and move to a determination that our own human reason is the instrument through which our lives find their paths to meaning. In fact, we're going to be looking at some big pictures as we continue, rather than focusing narrowly on specifically defined technical problems. For example, we'll look at what human beings in past centuries were concerned about. For example, in the ancient world, the great human concern perhaps was death, how the fact that we in fact die affects us, and how it forces us to understand life. We will note a time, it's often associated with the Protestant Reformation, when the overarching human concern was with guilt. Are we doing the right thing? What ought we do? Why do we not always do the right thing? In our time, and I think especially starting near the beginning of the 20th century, we arrive at a concern with meaning, and that will be core to our reflections together. it becomes not a question of rightness or wrongness, but rather, what is it that really matters? What is it that truly has meaning? Is there anything worth doing? Is there anything that is genuinely meaningful? Another big picture suggests that if you start with the philosophy of Plato, one of the great philosophers of the Western world, and in fact a great believer that we are not of this world, and a philosopher who distinguished it between appearance and reality, well, if we are to believe one line of thought, the relentless development of Western thought brings us eventually to a world where technology triumphs. This is a world where technology is viewed more and more as the solution to everything, and where human life, therefore, is altogether in this world and does not have a home elsewhere. Still another view leads to Nietzsche, who said that Western thoughts developed in such a way that sources of significant experience are dwindling and are therefore fewer and fewer, and there are fewer things that matter. In short, that meaning in a deeper sense no longer has any grounding. Let me pause and reflect with you on this. There have been big pictures, one of which has suggested that the deepest of human issues is that our life ends. Another, that we are in some way, often this has been associated with religions, imbued with a guilt that we cannot understand and we can't either understand how to overcome. But a more contemporary concern has been a concern with what life means and whether it has a meaning. And it is this concern that we will be reflecting on, and we will be asking and wondering together whether philosophy can help us to pursue the path of determining whether life has meaning, and even whether the question whether life has meaning is a legitimate one. But let's now continue on. Ours is really an uncertain time. I think we all know that, when everything is getting questioned. We're concerned about politics. We have great growing economic concerns. And we live in a world now where more and more it seems as if there are continuing natural disasters. We can't help but notice controversies about the nature and the future of religion, and seeming wars between religions. And underlying this has to be, among other things, for any of us, a kind of desire to find an overview, a way of looking at things that makes sense, helps us to see how we got to where we are, and whether there's a way out of the situation that some worry we might be in. When the Axial model was in place, people understood themselves on a journey of life. And that journey of life, as I indicated, was from appearance to reality. It was meant to be an liberating journey. And it was supposed to bring us to a kind of insight, an insight about what mattered, and thereby we'd be touched and touched by meaning. When the Enlightenment came, and here I'm thinking primarily about the Enlightenment of the 18th century, which is said to have begun in France, reason, human reason, came to replace faith and tradition. Now, do we live in a world where we have no overview, no schema to make sense of the things that happen and how they fit together? Have we become concerned about the price of all things, but the value of nothing? Has something happened that's unfolded through the 18th century Enlightenment that has brought us to the position where we seek out technology as the solution for every problem, as if we can fix and manipulate things better than we could, when all is said and done, understand and appreciate them. An important consideration in this course involves the history of philosophy. Initially, and almost until the 20th century, philosophical investigation involved the development of a systematic picture of the cosmos, where we fit into things and what the nature and connection of things was. In the past 2 centuries, philosophy has moved to a concern with history and how we fit into the course and direction of history. And in fact, for the 19th century especially, there was a great concern to articulate and understand a pattern to history, and that if we could understand that pattern, maybe then we could fit in or at least see what the direction of the human spirit was. For many decades now, the academic discipline of philosophy has become more focused on specific technical areas of investigation, primarily on conceptual issues. In fact, some time ago, Bertrand Russell said that, well, philosophy had become the systematic abuse of technical terms that had specifically been invented for that purpose. William James actually once said that philosophy was the search in a dark room for a black cat that wasn't there. And I'll have to admit to you that once on an airplane flight, when it got out to my seatmate that I was a philosophy professor, that person said, "Well then, tell me what some of your sayings are." Conceptual technical philosophy does not get so much involved in that. It is a very, very technical pursuit, an articulate one. At the same time, it's one that requires a great deal of intricate analysis. But it is true that technical philosophy has distanced itself from many people because they prefer that philosophy concentrate on questions regarding core human concerns, such as the meaning of life. And they think that philosophy owes us a reflection on those concerns. But philosophy can actually do that. And that's what we're going to be exploring in our time together. You see, philosophy can also be construed in our time, not just as a technical discipline. It can be construed also as guidance in the art of living, the pursuit of the very meaning of life and the means for attaining this meaning. There have been examples of this from the past. It isn't as if philosophy just recently has taken on these questions. Philosophy throughout its history has had these moments where it has been far less technical, far more absorbed in questions about what is it to be a human and what am I to do fully to experience and to achieve the meaning of human life. Think back for a moment on Socrates, considered by many the father of Western philosophy. He described philosophy as a learning how to die. What he meant by that, what was implied, was coming to know what human life really is. Not just how to live through it, but how to live it well. And more recently, and this one is close to my heart, and you'll best keep this in mind as we continue, the American philosopher John Dewey, who lived from about 1859 to 1952, claimed that philosophy only deserved attention and respect if it no longer considered just technical problems, if it turned from dealings with what Dewey called the problems of philosophers and returned its attention to the pressing problems of human beings. Philosophy, in this sense, involves bringing things into question that maybe hadn't been questioned before. And it also involves recognizing that the way in which these questions eventually get resolved isn't just going to be some abstract piece of knowledge we get. How these deep philosophical questions of what the meaning of life might be get resolved will reverberate back upon and make a difference and influence the way in which we ourselves live our lives. We can't distance ourselves from questions about the meaning of life if we reflect on them philosophically. They're never meant to be just abstract concerns. They're meant to be taken up in a way that we have to think about them. And if we think about them seriously, our life is most likely in some ways to be changed. In philosophy construed as a guide to living, there is an important difference. We can hardly dwell on this enough. An important difference between providing information and, on the other hand, engendering a kind of engagement with fundamental questions and issues. If we do that at all successfully, what it's going to make us do is participate in the probing of some of these issues and a reflecting on alternative ways of solving them. Now, obviously, information's important. It is terribly important that we have information, but it can compel a kind of misleading objectivity, an objectivity where you just stand back and look at things, you put things into some kind of objective formation, and you develop in a careful way a common understanding. But as you do this, what happens is that you find yourself complying with a kind of system. You find yourself complying with the formation and what it dictates. And in the midst of gathering that information and putting it together systematically, often what fails to happen is a deep and more probing investigation of the underlying issues. We need to keep in mind that philosophical engagement, and that's exactly what I hope that we can have together, it's not arbitrary. It's not just sharing opinions. It's not merely subjective. As we're going to see, it requires a rigor and a care of its own, and it's something that I hope we can pursue together. And by that, I mean that I hope that the questions that I bring up with you are questions that you will think about and you will wonder about. And as you think about them, perhaps sometimes thinking they're, very complex and other times too simple, that the very thinking about them will draw you to say, well, should this make a difference to how I think? Should this make a difference to how I see the world? I've chosen some particular philosophers to be the means through which we will undertake our journey, and particularly I've chosen some European philosophers on which to focus primarily in the course of what I hope will be our journey together. You might well ask, why have I chosen these particular philosophers? And how is it that they turn out to be primarily European philosophers? Well, it's because I think they speak in important ways to the time in which we now find ourselves. One of these philosophers, Hegel, who we will be talking about soon, and who lived from 1770 to 1831, said philosophy is the child of its time. But he also said philosophy is its time comprehended in thought. What I believe is that these European philosophers and their philosophies reflected their time, and that they did in different ways, and they didn't agree with each other, catch up and comprehend their time in thought. And what I believe is in many respects the case is that today, the now in which we live, the now we hope to understand, is in many ways the consequence of what these European philosophers, in their strange revealing unusual ways said about what life in the world was like. For example, they, as a group, disagreeing with each other, are concerned to explore the limits of human reason. Remember, I told you that the Enlightenment period of the 18th century wanted to get beyond what they thought of as tradition and superstition, wanted simply to focus and rely on reason. And these European philosophers we'll be talking about together take that as a starting point. But as we're going to see, they worry very much about what reason is capable of, what it can do. If we must rely on it, what hope can we truly have? One might think, perhaps we can't rely on human reason. We must jump back to faith. We must go some other route. These European philosophers, who we have to think of in ways as contemporary, because they take reason so seriously, do insist that wherever we go, we start with reason. And that is important for us to keep in mind in any pathway we take toward understanding the meaning of our time and whether our time offers meaning in life. Now, these same European philosophers also tend to pay close attention to our lives in the world, enmeshed in culture and questing after significant opportunities for self-understanding and personal development. They do not just analyze concepts. I don't mean to depreciate the careful, technical, conceptual analysis of ideas. That's important. It's a part of professional philosophy. But these philosophers we'll be talking about together, though they also did that sort of technical thing, they also did focus on concrete human life in the world. And they also focused on the likely course of history. Marx, for instance, whom we'll be talking about, as is commonly known, thought revolution was the future. And Michel Foucault, a French philosopher of the 20th century, thought that there were dramatic changes that happened periodically in history. And Peter Drucker, who is in a school of management and is considered by many a great thinker living in our time, said that particular times would come, and Drucker thinks we're in one now, where a dramatic change will occur, where people living 20 years from now, the early 21st century, people living 20 years from now will look back on us and hardly recognize us in the same way that looking forward, we could not even imagine what they might be like. In our time, there have been various overlapping guides to living, and they can be seen as reconfiguring the way we understand life in very distinctive ways. For example, reference to the past, which has been so much part of us, we call it our heritage, is giving way to hopes regarding the future. And there's been a growing ascendancy of political values and economic theories as providing the rubric, the framework for understanding life now, its opportunities, and its hopes. Another thing that has happened is that we have seen, and we're going to see more, of biotechnologically driven human enhancement opportunities, where through biotechnology, human life might be altered, enhanced, changed in significant ways. And that will dramatically bring into question traditional values. It may well be the case also that general economic outlooks, economic theories, theories of the world of money have replaced, in important ways, more traditional ways of understanding life in the world, religious or political ones, for example. It's actually quite possible that we are living under a tyranny of the economic metaphor, and we'll want to give some reflection on that. There are other concerns that emerge too, and they regard ways in which we are better able to be in the world, and less to think of any other notion of world, literal or metaphorical. And these ways of being in the world are coming to dominate concerns, rather than allow us to reflect more in perhaps transcendent dimensions to ourselves that might be hidden from ourselves. We see a variety of things that are puzzling. I think we know them well in one sense, but I think we should dwell on them and they should concern us. We know that the transporting features of high culture, which many celebrate, have progressively been receiving commercial retranslation through mass marketing. We know that the notion of the lower and the higher as it applies to culture has altered in such a way that everything has been meant to be made easily available. And maybe in being made easily available, some people actually use this phrase, dumb down, something has been lost. And we also know, we can hardly avoid knowing it by looking at popular magazines, in many ways informative magazines, that medical avenues and ideas have received more and more emphasis. They've received an emphasis and an extension that was previously granted primarily to religion. More and more we hear about medicine as the cure for all kinds of things that in the past we might thought of as just simply part of life. Now, in the course of our journey, which we are about to undertake, we'll be considering 4 basic themes. And we're going to look at them from an historical standpoint, how we came to have these themes upon us as ones that we need to reflect on. And we're going to be looking also at some of the themes that are upon us, thematically, not just historically. It's been said that though we are in, we're not altogether of the world. This notion, the axial understanding of human life, as I mentioned at the beginning of our time together, was significantly impacted by 18th century philosophical thinking, what we've called the 18th century Enlightenment, and its emphasis that we must conquer superstition through reason and knowledge. We need to look at this and understand its implications. It's been said that as well and often that fundamental themes of human concern increasingly revolve more and more around meaning and meaninglessness, rather than around guilt and innocence or questions about immortality versus extinction. A controversy has also emerged over the very asking of questions about meaning. Is the asking of questions about meaning a necessary avenue to take to a better understanding of the depth of life and the possibilities of life? Or is it possible that asking questions about what life means actually indicates that perhaps we suffer from some unfortunate illness? We perhaps have not matured. We are in various kinds of situations that oppress us, and to compensate for that, we ask questions about the meaning of life. Some will say questions about the meaning of life are necessary to ask for us truly to be human. Others will say that the asking of them indicates that something has gone wrong, and we only ask them because we are in perhaps an uncomprehended form of trouble. We'll need to look into that. Are these valid questions, or are they symptomatic of some other kind of trouble that we would ask the questions at all? Finally, what is the nature and status of human reason since the Enlightenment? Has reason come to be understood as a means of resolving all questions? Or might there be alternative means From out of the concentration and celebration of reason in the 18th century, a number of philosophers have actually looked at, through, and beyond human reason. And they've come up with different and in some ways extraordinary ways to think about and to walk the path toward answers to what life means. We'll be looking at these matters and all these questions in a careful way as we move forward in our time together.